Dun, 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 dun.
Is that our intro music now? I like it. It's good.
This is Avocado Ink.
It's been a bit.
It's been too long. We
Yeah.
are both finishing a very stressful semester. We both are doing capstones this semester.
We both turned in capstones yesterday.
That could be a fun topic to talk about.
Actually, yeah, it could be.
Um,
Maybe we should.
we can start off with blowing off some steam about our capstones.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, capstones are great. It's like a final project for your degree. You're supposed to be, leading up to this point. Yeah. So you research for a full semester, trying to come up with a topic and information to use, and you're supposed to immerse yourself in the actual world where the philosophy's happening. And the following semester, you write a very long paper over 20 pages. Mine ended up being 35. About some thesis that's supposed to be original, it's supposed to be creative, philosophically rigorous, the whole kit and caboodle. The one thing that you aren't told is that leading up to, the summit of your philosophy career in your undergraduate program also leads you to the summit of all of the problems with philosophy.
They don't
Just
tell
in
you
general.
that you'll hate it at the end.
Yes, exactly. Don't get me wrong. Philosophy, greatest thing ever. But there's some things that need to be fixed in philosophy.
Yeah, there's something there for sure.
For sure.
I mean, part of it we were talking about is this, when you have an editor, it's their job to hate everything that you do
Yeah.
in an attempt to make it better. And, good theory, terrible in practice. Talk about a way to make yourself, feel terrible and
Yeah. No, it's
question your ability to think and make arguments.
Well, because if you take the idea of an editor here, the editor is trying to help your paper get from where it is to where it needs to be, which begs the question, where does it need to be?
Exactly.
And where it needs to be is it needs to be having a good effect on people that would be reading it in some journal or to be trying to glean new philosophical information out of it. That kind of feedback is not something you're going to get from someone who's trying to edit your paper. They're not going to be reading it as if they were looking for information in philosophy. They're going to be reading it as in trying to find problems in it, which can be useful, but it also is not the feedback. It's not accurate feedback in that sense.
Yeah.
You're not getting an actual take on what your paper is going to look like in the real world. You're getting a very fabricated take on the worst way someone could take it.
One of the things we noticed was that instead, if an editor reads your paper and they have some kind of question about it, generally speaking, instead of sitting there and thinking about the way in which you might have already answered it, kind of the go-to position is, well, this must be a flaw in the paper.
Yes.
Right?
Which is particularly interesting with a capstone paper, because in the capstone paper, you're supposed to have researched a lot. You're supposed to be familiar with the world, which means that you are the one who is familiar with how your paper is going to be read or how people read these types of papers, because you're immersed there. The person editing your paper, probably not so much, which means that you're probably writing every sentence of your paper with the pitfalls that are common in mind, trying to avoid them. But someone editing your paper doesn't know that. So they're going to miss the times that you've been corralling the thought process. And then when they get to a common pitfall, they'll just fall into it and be like, this is your fault. I don't know if that's possible to avoid, but yeah.
Yeah. No, there's funny moments for sure. Definitely not all bad things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my capstone definitely got a lot better with revision. But I do think, a funny example is that I'm talking about a bias towards how we treat animals. And I'm look, there's this person, non-person dichotomy that people like Kant really solidified, that, you can either be a thing that is an end within itself or not. And it's really pervasive. And I'm why does it have to be a dichotomy? Why can't we just have a spectrum? And my professor sent back to me saying, I like your idea that this personhood can be more of a spectrum. But couldn't somebody respond by saying that then they're just not enough of a person. And I wanted to just like throw something at the wall because the funny thing is that if you are asking the question, are you enough of a person? Then you are no longer dealing with a spectrum. You're dealing with just a different dichotomy, which was the whole problem. Like, my argument was supposed to be saying that, like,
you can't do this dichotomy thing.
If you've got a spectrum of personhood, then that means that you get as much, like, your desserts of personhood are requisite to the degree of personhood. So there is no sufficiency qualifier. There's just, whatever is due is kind of the basic idea. But this sort of thing has happened a number of times. It's very humorous, very frustrating.
No, in both of our papers. I think both of our papers have run up against a particular wall in philosophy, which is that we're not. I guess I want to say we're just not philosophically full of ourselves when it comes to our argument. Like, we don't actually take ourselves to be changing like anything dramatically. We don't take ourselves to be proving anything to the nth degree and like forcing the world to comply to our views. Most of it is probably more accurately described as just like commentary on the thought process in a particular field, which we take to be the most important part of philosophy, but that's not what philosophy is supposed to be, apparently.
I don't know. Who knows what it's supposed to be? That's like when I wrote my paper in response to my Kant professor trying to argue that because we were studying Hume at the time, that philosophy isn't dead, because Hume was like, is philosophy dead? And our professor's like, well, is it? And my response is basically just like, well, no, because philosophy is really good at internal critiques. So even if we don't think we can ever say this is the metaphysic of anything, like we can't even prove cause and effect, Humean skepticism, let's take it all the way on, that still leaves us with the idea that if we take on a theory of cause and effect, the philosopher still has something to say, right?
Yeah.
There's an internal critique that's available. And he was basically like, so what you're saying is philosophy is dead. Because he's a Kantian and he wants to be able to argue like the end. He wants to be able to say, this is it. Yeah. I've proven it, right? That sort of thing.
The whole thing.
It's very different approach.
And this ties back to why editors have it hard, or that role is almost impossible to take, because say you're doing what we're doing, commenting on like the thought process of a particular field. Mine's abortion, his is animal ethics. If you're the editor, your thought process is not what we're addressing, because you're just the editor. You're not the people that are thinking through this thing. You're not a person trying to justify animal cruelty.
It's so true.
You're not a person trying to justify a particular policy in abortion. Your thought process is not what we're commenting on, which means when you try and read what our comments, you're going to be like, I don't feel like this really addresses the actual problems here. And you're like, no shit. Like, of course you don't feel this way.
We are well aware that you're like much more mature than a lot of the people that we're trying to talk to.
This is the wild thing, because like with my paper, it's specifically trying to talk to people who believe life begins at conception. I won't get into the argument at all, but what's fascinating is that the people that have the most beef with my argument are the ones who don't, that aren't those people, that actually don't think life begins at conception.
It's been fascinating.
I've had issues with people who are pro-abortion. That's where the issues have come from. And I'm like, I'm not critiquing you guys. I'm trying to like, and I think you've had a similar thing where it's like most of the people you're talking to already are kind of on the animal ethics train.
And they want to dig into the nitty gritty of like, if I'm trying to critique a basic kind of what people take to be a defeater of animal ethics, like they're not smart enough, or they're not, they're not people, or they don't have free will. I'm just trying to critique those more basic rejections of the project.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And then, the editor comes in and they're like, well, people aren't so sure about the specifics of how this would work out in this. Have you thought about how this would affect disability rights? And I'm just like, these are all cool thoughts, but I feel like you're missing why I wrote this.
No, literally, the feeling that you get, the feeling is that, like, you're on the phone with someone trying to have a serious conversation, and then the person editing your paper or the philosophy department in general is there standing with you, and they're only getting your half of the conversation, and so you say something and they're like, no, that's not okay, no, you said that wrong, that point needs to be changed, and you're just like, you have no clue what the other person is saying right now. You're not the other end of this phone call, and you don't know the other end of this phone call. So, yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, it's very fun though.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, well, we can say that now because we turned in our final drafts yesterday. So maybe I'm just speaking from privilege. I would not recommend it. But I think, well, and I should say, because some of you might ask, yes, you are welcome to read either of our capstones if you actually desire to. They are fun and might convince you that life begins at conception is kind of squirrely. It's pretty squirrely, and they might also convince you that well, I don't want to encourage self-hatred in any respect. Just that maybe you haven't been thinking about animals in a very logical way.
Yeah, this is true. Yep. Also, squirrely is not a euphemism there. Like, that's literally all I'm trying to show. I'm not like, I've disproven it. No, I'm literally just like, something's weird.
Yeah.
It's 35 pages to say that.
If you take this, do you realize what that means? It's basically the whole paper. Yep. Too much fun.
And well, and yours is kind of similar in that you're like, here's all these things we say about animals. They're a little weird.
Yeah.
Have you been saying these things? Because if you have, that's concerning, maybe just a little bit.
Yeah. At the very least, it's going to make you question your justification for ignoring animal.
Yeah. Well, and mine will make you question your justifications for treating this phrase like it's, just a given.
Yeah. You can tell we are on the same page about a lot of things. So even our capstones ended up being similar in tone.
Yep.
So a couple of things we wanted to talk about, besides that very enjoyable detour, was the very cathartic detour, I should say.
Yes.
Thank you, Aristotle. Is first returning to this inertia idea. If you happen to listen to our conservatism as inertia episode, it's a very fun idea, talking about the way in which there are a lot of ideologies that are available to us when we think about the world and our motivations for why we do things, why we even investigate things, the sources that we take to be serious sources of knowledge and those that we don't. And you can kind of map all of this out in a cosmological way where you imagine that each of these ideas has a kind of mass to it.
Yes.
It has a potential inertial force.
Pulls you in certain directions.
Right?
And I actually think that well, first off, I love this idea just because I think it's true. I think that things in our lives do have some effect on us, and that is what we're trying to navigate. It's all those different things that pull us in directions. But then also, I think that it can make a lot of intuitive sense, because if you're like, okay, well, he moved to the city and then he became like this,
Right.
That's a perfectly logical thing for someone to say. It's like, oh, well, once he went to college, he now is a Marxist.
Those darn liberals.
The idea is that education systems, that a university has a certain inertia to it that will push you in the direction of Marxism. This is not necessarily true. Just this is a hypothetical. But you can do this with anything. A religion, people take it that will make you a better person. This is a common belief about religions, that it gives you a certain ethical inertia, makes you care about the poor more or something like that. Unfortunately, there are some that are not so great, like the idea that an atheist will make you care about nothing, like being an atheist. So that has a certain inertia that pulls you in a direction that's not good. At least that's what a lot of people in the United States think.
Yeah. And this is all over the place. I feel like we get sucked into these inertial forces far more easily than we at first realize. this conversation between maybe a socialist and capitalist approach is a very interesting one to bring up, because I took a Marxism class
Mhm.
in which we studied with the department chair for a while, and I learned a lot of things about Marxism that I just had no idea about before, and I felt like I had all of these cool things to talk about, and then I end up having, I don't know how many conversations now with my family at different times about these ideas, and I'm realizing that there are forces at play that make conversations themselves difficult.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like, I had to be in a particular position to be able to understand what Marx was actually getting at. Because I have to be perfectly honest, before my Marxism class, I had practically no positive ideas about Marxism, socialist ideals, any
Yeah.
of that.
Mhm.
I had ideas about how the world worked, and I was pretty sure that they were decent ideas. And when I was in this situation where it was a class and I had a teacher that I trusted, I was willing to be influenced a little bit more,
Yeah.
right? And suddenly I start thinking about this, and I'm like, wow, he's got a good point. In some respects, and then I go and talk with my family, and I start to see the forces that are acting in their lives to create a narrative, right?
Mhm.
Just as it is in mine, and the way that these interact is complicated and really really difficult,
Yeah.
because the nature of two ideas that are full of inertia is basically that you don't feel like you can skim in between them in any way.
Mhm.
It's
Just
constantly a
too
battle,
chaotic. Yeah.
yeah, between like, I've got to be on this side fighting for this, or I've got to
Mhm.
be on this
Yeah.
side fighting for this.
I think inertia is such a great metaphor for this. I think because like we all kind of know that sensation that you get trying to like move something around that's really heavy. Like if you've ever had like a rolling counter with full of books and you're like moving it around in like the library or something. It's like, oh, this has so much weight to it. Trying to stop it is hard and stuff. But I also think that like I've been using this metaphor personally, trying to talk about uh, conversations with people and getting people on the same page. And I feel like frequently the motion that you're doing is you're kind of like almost like you're trying to settle a big boat in a dock. And so you're like, oh, we're gonna pull up and then we're gonna let it settle a little bit, and then it's a little bit off, so we'll do it again. And you kind of just like back and forth as you try and like just get everything settled down. And it's like if you're dealing with really strong ideological structures, then it's like you're trying to do that, but the tide's going out or something, and there's these like big waves that are constantly pushing you around, so you can never like actually settle anywhere. It's too much going on.
Yeah. I guess the point is, or one of the main points I wanted to make is that this settling problem is largely determined by the loci of all of these
Mhm.
inertial ideas. And what that means, because it's a very obtuse way of putting it, is that, um, like, imagine an ideological field in which nothing had a disproportionate inertial
Mhm.
power to anything else. And by the way, I should just throw out that we're using inertia in a very colloquial sense here. There's sometimes when a physicist would be like, aren't you talking about gravity? Anyway, I'm just talking about mass and the way that it interacts with the world, and calling it inertia because it works. So
Mhm. Yeah.
the like, imagine a field where it's all equal, where there are just a bunch of ideas, and you don't feel like there's any particular weight to any of these
Yeah.
ideas.
Mhm.
You're not perceiving authority in one idea or another. You're not perceiving cultural significance, whatever it might be that gives something weight. In that kind of a world, you could land anywhere. Like, really think about this for a second. There, you wouldn't be dealing in dichotomies.
Yeah. No. Not at
Right?
all.
You would just be, you'd just find the place.
You'd fall exactly where you,
and
wanted.
everyone would have the hardest time talking to each other. This is the funny thing, is that this inertia of ideas makes it both easier for people to talk to each other because you have loci to reference.
Yes.
But then it's also harder for you to talk with people
Because now there's all these forces.
Yeah, because it forces you into dichotomies.
Here's a really great example. So let's say we are having a conversation about, world history. And we're like, okay, evolution is a thing. All I've said is evolution is a thing. Do you feel the pull away from Christianity, though? Like, why would those be connected? You know why they're connected because you know the history and you know how these, like, ideologies work. The idea is that there's this, like, negative force between evolution and Christianity. Now, they can't go together, but the force is there, and it's going to pull people around. And that's weird because they're just ideas.
Yeah. So interesting. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about how death functions as perhaps the most powerful inertia. It's so fascinating because think about it. Death is nothing more than an idea.
Yeah.
For all we know,
none of us have experienced it.
Yeah, at the very least, none of us have experienced it. So we can't say anything about it directly. We just have an idea that, like, it's a thing. But what makes it so, like, how much poetry, how much film and debate has been made over the idea of death, right?
Yeah.
I think there's an explanation, certainly, for why it has so much inertia. I mean, it is a kind of metaphysical line where, like, that we have no access past it. And that's really bizarre because that's not true for, like, practically any other idea that we have, right? Maybe I could say I don't have direct access to Hinduism, but I can go talk to somebody who has direct access to Hinduism. So that kind of a boundary is just so different than this boundary of death, where it's an idea that by definition, when somebody has crossed it, they can't cross back.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And it is like, the inertial force, like right now, you're probably like, okay, death is like a big mover here. Like definitely has a big impact. But I will say the more you look into all of the things that have strong influence on you in your life, the more you will find that all of them are either directly motivated by death or like strongly influenced by it. That if you were to get rid of the inertia of death, they wouldn't make as much sense anymore.
Yeah.
Like you can even take something as simple as this idea of like progress. You're like, I want my life to get somewhere. If you get rid of the inertia of death, the idea that you should be pushing really hard to get somewhere doesn't make as much sense anymore because you'd basically be seeing yourself as immoral. You wouldn't, not immoral, immortal. You wouldn't be concerned about having a time limit on this stuff. So the idea of progressing as much as you can right now kind of loses its weight. Not because progress is connected to death directly, but because the inertia of death actually ends up like seeding this idea of doing things before you die.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It's built into every relationship you have. Like literally with old people that you interact with, a part of your brain is just sitting there thinking about this gigantic thing called death that's just inescapable with all of your interactions with them. You're just like, you're gonna die sometime and I've got to like deal with this, and like you're gonna have to deal with this or not deal with this. I don't know what that means for you. Like it's just hanging there. And it's so shocking for us when we hear stories of young people dying.
Yeah.
I mean, like my brother died at 19, and that was like the feeling that seemed like for me and for my whole family is just that there was this thing that we had to deal with. Like it could have just been that we got to spend 19 years with my brother, Like it could have just been that the idea gets flattened so that all the information that we have about him and our lives with him and everything is just there. That's
Yeah.
what it is, right? But instead, there's like this weight of everything that we imagined that he could be, and like the weight of what we imagined that he thought that he could be.
Yeah.
And and it just like it's wild how disproportionate that is
Yeah.
to all of the other possible ideas about him. Like even birth is another good way of
Yeah. No, like, and the easiest way to do this
Comparing
one
that.
is just go ask your grandparents to tell you about a few years before your birth what the world was like. Like, even if you already know the answers to everything, just sitting there having them explain, like, 1992 or something, if you're our age, is gonna blow your mind for no
Right.
reason.
Right?
You're just gonna be
And
like,
they're just like, wait, what?
yeah.
Yeah, I had that. I was watching a film for a class just today, and the guy is like, how long has it been since you've been here? And he's like, oh, it's been like 30 years. And the tour guide with him is like, oh, that's how old I am. And I just had this moment of like, there was a time when that person like didn't exist, but he was still alive. And you know this feeling, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Just kind of like blows your mind a little bit. And so there certainly is an inertial power to birth, right?
Yes.
But what's funny is that it seems like what is so powerful about birth is its relation to death.
Yes, death still seems like the motivator here.
Right.
It's wild. And I will say, this is a shout out, because we like to, we exist in a philosophical world. Heidegger talks a lot about this. The idea that we are being towards death is a fundamental part of his structure of Dasein, which he takes to be like our essence in a way.
Mhm.
He'd probably get really mad at that sentence itself, but
It's going to take you forever to explain Dasein. So
yeah,
why?
we're not gonna go there. The other one that I would like to point to is Freud. Freud talks about death and this death drive
Yes.
very strongly, especially in his later stuff. And eventually, like, that becomes for him like just like this is the explanation for just about anything, is this death drive that exists. Wild.
And there's so much fiction that's been written about this. Like, it's fascinating.
Mhm.
The number of sorry.
Did it stop?
I don't think so. I think we're still going.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, that was
We're
weird. Computer freaked out. But the number of authors that might be listed among what you'd call like the greats,
Yeah.
they all have work about death.
Mhm.
Like it's all it's all so connected to mortality. Some of my favorite stories, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, all have a theme within them that if you were immortal, life wouldn't be what it is. That maybe there's something to be like, maybe there's something valuable about being immortal. Sure, that could be a thing. Like imagine the elf from Tolkien or something like that. But it's a different kind of life. It's a different kind of existence
Fundamentally.
because this thing called death is it shapes everything that we are in a real psychological way.
Yeah. And actually, I think this is one of the, I mean, I don't want to turn this into a pitch for something, but I do take to be one of the very strongest arguments for an atheist perspective to be the fact that I feel like its relationship to death is the most justifiable and the most natural. And we could, I mean, that's not going to make sense to anyone who legitimately believes the cosmology of something else, for sure. Yeah. But it is fascinating to me how one of the linchpins of a lot of religious thought is a difficulty with engaging with that. Whether or not it's this idea that, like, by getting rid of the fear of death, by promising an afterlife, you actually change people's behavior in a lot of negative ways frequently. We learned about in class just the other day that there was a whole group of Christians that started committing suicide because they were like, this is the cheat code. Like, I'll just have a really great day one of these days and repent, go to church, and then I'll kill myself.
Yeah, before you can sin.
Exactly. And actually, this is apparently where a lot of our taboo surrounding suicide came from, was the response to that. Very fascinating. But the point being that, like, there's something that arose purely because a religion changed the inertia of death by redefining what death meant in their cosmology. And you'll find similar stories in any structure. Like, just tampering with that changes people dramatically.
Yeah. No, I would, unsurprisingly, agree with the assessment that there's a certain way in which it matters which cosmology you take on. Because it doesn't seem fair to me to say that there's just equal justification for all of them. Like, take this example, like, you're someone living your life and you're taught about Christianity, and this appears to be a serious idea to you that, and I know this isn't what a lot of Christians today believe, but let's just take this as the example. You don't want to sin, you're trying to avoid it. And what if it was actually true?
Yeah.
Like, theologically, that if you lived a good day and then killed yourself, you'd just be set, like, ticket to heaven, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean about your life, and how do you justify that action? Like, that figures in to what you might take to be your justification for believing in the faith at all.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think so, but explain a little bit further, because I don't know if other people would be following.
Yeah. So the reason that this is significant is because this kind of an idea, you can even almost show that it is a quote unquote lesser idea because it's not a popular idea today. So in other words, I'm kind of trying to argue that the weight of these cosmological ideas follows the cost of their justification, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Right? Because the theology of Christianity has changed because there was an unjustifiable tenet in that respect.
Well, and yeah, you see this go back and forth in any religion throughout its history. I think the most fascinating one is in the LDS religion because of their constant updating of, like, information. They're not like, oh, it's the same book forever. They're like, we'll add to it every half year, which it's fascinating because then you actually get, like, canonical stuff talking about this back and forth because you'll have this, like, look, you've made it into the kingdom of heaven type thing. And this is a popular idea for in LDS just culture, that, like, everyone gets into heaven more or less. Like, it's just which part of heaven you're in is the idea. And what is the immediate accidental, like, thing that comes out of that? It's that people stop caring about this life as much as they should. Exactly. And so the response,
like, well, actually,
it's like, well, this is actually, it's important because it's the time for testing you. So actually, you should treat this as a finite period of time that is really important, and you should focus on this one life that you get. And then people start focusing on this one life that they get, and they start caring too much about death and stuff like that.
They get anxious, and perfectionism sets in.
Exactly. And so they flip it around again, and they're like, but you have a temple recommend, which means you're getting in. That's how that works.
Or it goes even further, and they're like, remember, by Christ's grace, you're already saved.
Yeah.
So you don't actually have to worry about this life.
And then it flips again, and they're like, but works are how you express your faith. That's how we know. You got to do the work. You got to do the work. And then I've personally seen some wildly complicated diagrams trying to figure this out in seminary classes, where they're like, here's all the good you could do in your life. Here's the amount of good you will do in your life. Here's the promise that Christ gives you to make up for everything you didn't do, as long as you did as much as you could do. And it's like, it goes back and forth. And the hilarious thing is that you could try and piece through what's going on here, but it really is very simple. It's that death is the strongest motivator, period.
Yeah.
And tampering with it means you have to, account for what you're going to change, which means you're going to end up with this weird place where people should feel like their lives end. Like that's where you have to end up, because that's what motivates people.
Wow, that is such a good example. And it really highlights the way that trying to create a narrative of what happens after death is always going to have a direct effect on the inertia that we take death to have in our lives right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And do you think it's true that maybe that's always exploitative?
I think so.
Because all the examples you just brought up show, and what I mean by that is that we've got a claim that you're all going to heaven, which means you don't care about life.
Exactly.
Or you better work or you ain't going to heaven, which means you just go insane, right? Perfectionism kills you,
yep.
right? Yeah. And there doesn't seem to be a very good way to make a middle ground about that, right? Because, and by the way, this is interesting because this particular debate is as old as Joseph Smith himself, at least, right? He's there's a specific reference of this in the Book of Mormon, Nephi, saying you be saved after all that he can do.
Yeah.
Right? Which is funny because in and of itself, when you think about that, that forces you to take one or the other position. You either take all that you can do to be what you're going to naturally do, which means you don't care about life, and then you're saved. Or you take all that you can do to be like,
you only have one life, do it
consuming thing, right? Right. There's no, I mean, you could try to be like, all I can do is just like, sometimes I care and then sometimes I don't. But that's, again, not giving a consistent interpretation to the phrase. So,
well, and I don't know if any of the listeners here would have had this happen, but if you've ever had the example they use where they kind of played out and they're like, here's the path to God. They like draw a line on the ground. They like put a piece of tape down and you're like walking off it. And then they're like, take one step off the line, and then like you like end up really far from where you're supposed to be. And they're like, how hard is it to get back to the line? And then they're like, and you're like, well, it's like 6 steps away or something like that. And they're like, no, that's not it. It's just as long as you're facing in the direction of the line. That's what matters. It's always, you can always get right back on the line. It's like this weird thing that like doesn't make any sense. Like if you really sit down and try and figure out what they're saying here, they're like, look, no, space is relative in relation to this line in such a way that you should feel really bad if you're falling away from this line, and that's bad, but also you're always very much so on the line as much as you need to be.
Okay, that's the best part about this example is that I can think of at least 2 explicit teachings that contradict this.
Yes.
You've got Elder Bednar's talk about how if you close your eyes and you're walking down the path and somebody, sneakily pushes you off to the side and then you realize how far away you were, his message is not that, as long as you direct yourself towards the line, you can keep going. No, the message is, look at how easily you can get fricked up by the devil. Yeah. It's like, you better be careful. and then Elder Uchtdorf's talk about being a pilot, and like, if you go off by like 2 degrees, and for your whole trip, you're off by like 500 miles by the end. Again, it's a message of like, you better not frick this up.
Yep. But the whole point is that these are a little bit incommensurable, these ideas. And what they're trying to do is get you to have the right attitude about your life, which is the first thing I want to point out, because when we say everything is motivated by death, there's a way you can interpret that seems that is not good, and I wouldn't say it's healthy at all. This idea that like this obsession with death is what should be motivating your life, or what is motivating your life. This like constantly thinking about death. That's not what we're trying to say here. What we are trying to point out, though, is that a sense of your own mortality, the fact that you do have a life and that life's end, is something that is a constant motivator. And it's not something that like you have to be conscious of even to do that. It's just that like that is in some way informs your like base attitude towards existing. You don't have to be thinking about your death all the time to have it motivate you. You just have, like, there's an attitude of mortality that you end up with. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Maybe a way to talk about that is that there is a kind of optimization that I think about sometimes. So we've talked about the religious problem where if you try to make a cosmological claim about what happens after death, then you get people to focus on death perhaps too much. I think that would be my basic claim, is that you just care about it too much, versus, an idea of you could take life to be, I'm trying to think of a thinker that would be a good example of this, where like you try to reduce it down to nothing, where death is no longer important to you. You're just living your life. I guess, and I really don't like using this example, but this is like the classic idea of the druggie. Like they
risking life every day,
or the hedonist. Even though I hate how both of those are pejorative terms, because I don't see why they need to be. Yeah. But just the idea that like with hedonism, all you care about is pleasure, and so like why would you worry about death, right?
Eat, drink, and be merry.
Exactly.
For tomorrow we die.
That was an explicit.
So I want to point out, because, and maybe, I don't know, I feel like religion has a tendency, or at least when I say religion, I just mean rewriting after death, like giving yourself a story for what happens after death. So maybe I shouldn't use,
because not all religions do.
Exactly. Yeah. There are plenty that don't. But doing that, having a cosmology of afterlife, it can have both the effect of making you obsess too much on your death and obsess too little on your death. The idea of like giving up on life because it doesn't matter is another thing that can come out of it. And I don't know, is that what you were trying to say when you said like the optimal?
Yeah. I definitely, that was a confusing way of putting it, but you're right. What I meant by it has an effect on your view of death is that it pushes it outside of what I would consider to be this is a bold claim for me to make, but what I consider to be the natural perception of death.
Yes.
Yeah. Right? Where you either feel like death is just abhorrent and how dare we ever watch anybody like kill each other, or like we can't ever like there's something traumatizing about it.
Which there certainly is to an extent, but the idea here is that it's
it's like
drawn out of proportion.
Yeah.
It's this like ultimate supernatural that cannot be reckoned with.
A good way of putting that is that if it is so traumatic to the point that you fail to even be able to think about what there was or what there is beside death, then that's kind of a problem.
It can be very all-consuming in a cognitive sense. Yes. Where you're like, we can't even engage with this idea in the many ways that you have to engage with this idea, whether it's because people die, or just because people die in society, and like that's a fact. You do have to like life does go on.
Yes.
There can be an over-obsession with its strangeness and its finality. But then there can also be the under-obsession with it, where you just don't consider it at all. You don't think it matters at all.
Yeah. And then it sneaks up on you or something like that, right? Which is why what I was trying to get at with the optimization comment is that, like, I've made a little bit of a small study for myself of people, of just older people, and basically gaining insight into the way that they think about their lives and the way they think about their death, or their certain death, which is an interesting phrase. But what I've noticed is that it seems like the people who live a really long time, and not that I'm like explicitly trying to advocate that our only goal in life is to live a really long time. I don't think it actually matters that much exactly how long you live. But if we take that to just be, generally a goodish thing, then the people who live a really long time seem to share an idea, an orientation towards death. None of them seem like really all that afraid of it.
Yeah.
I honestly have not been able to find one yet. And maybe they do exist. I don't know. But this is just from my experience. They don't they're not afraid of death. And in other words, there's no obsessive, this is so huge and crushing, I can't live my life sort of feeling about it. But they also, none of them are ignorant of it.
Yes. And in fact, they are very, we could even say exploitative of death.
Yes.
They're like, I will use this inertia for my own ends.
Yes. Because they're always the people who just keep on living despite the fact that everyone knows they're about to die.
Exactly. Have you ever had like your grandparent use that card? Where they're like, I'm gonna die. Spend time with me. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool. A lot of them, I've noticed, joke about their deaths.
Yeah,
a lot. They joke about the things that we like. This idea that there's like a list of healthy things that we need to be doing because otherwise we'll die. They laugh at this idea. Like they just do whatever they want. There's some great examples of this. There's the lady who's over 100 who drinks Dr. Pepper
every day.
Every day.
And like a lot of it too.
She's outlived like 3 doctors who told her that she'd die from it.
It's hilarious.
And then there are other like they'll be just like drinking or like partying in the small way they can, or like just chowing on pizza or making food for people, even though people should be making food for them, but they're just like determined to live and do. And it's absolutely fascinating. It makes me feel like that I don't know how to put it. That feels like the most natural, correct orientation to death that you could possibly have.
It's a very positive motivator in your life. It makes you live your life better. And live your life in like a more full way, but then also to like take it very seriously as well, because there is a certain extent to which you can say that like having a cosmology about death makes you stress less about this life type situation.
But it's usually in a taking death less serious way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're taking it 100% seriously, facing it, and that's, I don't know, it just seems very healthy to me.
Yeah. No, I wanted to bring that up. I think we could learn a lot from these kinds of people, and that society in general is often afraid to talk about. Like when we talk about life, we try to not talk about death in the same breath. If that makes sense.
Yeah. You're trying to separate those.
Yeah. When I think that's kind of the point, is that life is only a thing because of death, right?
Yeah.
And death is only a thing because of life.
Yeah. It's very, very fascinating.
So, do we also want to talk about the atheism thing?
I'm good with whatever. How long is this?
It's 48 minutes.
I mean, we can go into, I don't know how long it will be, but
it's not that long.
Let's do it.
Let's give you a nice smorgasbord today.
Yeah. Make up for the last weeks that we missed.
That's true. That's true. So if you aren't in the apologist circles, some of what I have to say is not going to make sense.
You're like, what?
You'll be like, why do you care about this?
But if you're at all in those circles, you'll be like, oh, wait, you're going to talk about this?
Yes. So I would like to talk about atheism versus agnosticism.
And the crowd goes wild.
Yeah, seriously. Man, there have been so many hot take videos on this. So many. Anyway, let me just throw out a couple things. First, there is an important definitional distinction that has to be made.
The etymology of these words.
Yeah, the technical truth of this, which so many people seem unaware of. Agnosticism is the idea that you can be fundamentally skeptical about metaphysical truths. So to be agnostic is to say that you don't know. It's an epistemological distinction.
Yes.
I do not know for sure.
Yes. And this is true in the history of the word as well. It's a made-up word, and it was made in response to two movements. One of them was a religious movement to try and prove religion through empiricism, through the empirical investigation. And the other one was a similar type of move to try and prove all of our common knowledge about the world through science. And there was a lot of sloppy investigation going on where people would say, I've proven this thing, and they really had just like tried to find some justification for something they already believed. And there was literally just a guy that got really fed up with it, and so he wrote this thing on agnosticism saying, look, you shouldn't say you know anything is the case unless you can prove it to be the case legitimately. And he basically took that to mean you can't say that you can prove God exists, and you can't say you can prove hardly anything actually is the case. The latter half of that usually got dropped pretty quickly as science got better at doing investigation, and we were left with just the religious critique of you can't say that God exists or that he doesn't exist. You have to remain skeptical on this point.
And on a lot of other things.
Yes.
Right. Kant famously put forth his ideas about the antinomies of free will, infinity, and God.
Yeah. You can definitely be agnostic about a lot of different things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to contrast that, these aren't popular ideas today, but they used to be. Pure forms of empiricism, rationalism, idealism would all be non-agnostic. They would be positions that claiming that we can actually give a full account of everything. So anyway, the point is that agnosticism in a very real sense is something that both atheists and theists take on all the time. I don't really know of any theists personally who would take on any kind of pure idealist position. They might take themselves to know, like, for sure a few things, like maybe that God exists and maybe some kind of metaphysical understanding of the world, but they're still going to be agnostic about plenty of things.
A lot of things. In fact, it's a very fun little experiment to do. You go and ask them what they are most certain of, and they'll tell you, and then you kind of break it into two parts, and you say, well, what if you found out that this was the case, or wasn't the case? Would that change your belief here? And usually you can boil it down to a few very basic ideas, and then the rest they're kind of just like, I'm agnostic on it.
Yes.
Like, I like to believe this.
Yes. And this is important because I want to make a claim right here that you can be a full-on agnostic and be any kind of atheist, any kind of theist that you want to be. Those are not mutually exclusive in any way, not at all. There are some religious traditions that will try to make it seem like in order to be a full member of the group, you have to abandon agnosticism to a certain extent. You have to claim real knowledge about certain things. But anyway, that's a pressure of the ideological system, and whether you believe that you are or are not agnostic about those, cool. But my point is that it's just weird. It's a very weird phenomena that atheism and agnosticism have been put in the same camp.
Yeah.
In other words, that they are both like opposite or separate from theism.
Because you can be an agnostic theist.
Absolutely. And so many people
just
are.
as easily and probably more commonly than you would be an agnostic atheist.
I would certainly argue. So
yeah.
And atheism, I want to make another hot take argument, which is not actually a hot take, but for some reason people think it is. Of course you can be an atheist. There's nothing irrational, illogical, anything like that about being an atheist. Now, if you're in the apologetic circles, you will know the classic response to this. Oh, yeah, how could you ever be an atheist? How could you know that there is no God? Isn't that just as untenable of a position to take as there is, as the theist claim, to know that there is a God? Well, no, this is silly, because that's not the theist claim, generally speaking. There are some circles in which it's always phrased in terms of knowing, but that is not generally what theism means. Theism simply means that you are positing a god. Now, you could take that posit to be well founded. You could take it to be something that you have great confidence in.
You could take it to be something you have only faith in.
Yeah, any of the above. But theism is an orientation towards a claim about the world.
Yes. Specifically a claim about the world involving God.
Yes.
That's the definition of this.
And thus, atheism is simply the opposite. It is an orientation towards the world which posits that there is no God.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which, if you've listened to what we have just stated, then you will easily see that these are on equal footing. Now, you could claim that there is better evidence for one or the other, and people do, but there's the idea that, of course, you can be a theist, but to be an atheist is just crazy, is silly.
Yes.
It doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. I kind of want to use an example here, because the idea is the reason why this gets tricky is that, like, the concept of God is very malleable, and so it's like anytime someone tries to disprove God, most people who are theists will just be like, you haven't disproven the God that I believe in.
Yeah.
And I would like to just, like, get it out of those muddy waters and use a practical example. So if I'm like, I don't like apples, like, I really don't like apples, if you were to then be like, but have you really tried all of the apples? Are you sure there isn't an apple that you don't like? Like, first off, there are some things about apples that should be universal about all the apples, so you could say I dislike these things. But on top of that, it's like, that's not that's not how that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's like to say that you can't say you dislike apples because you haven't tried all the apples, or because there's still the possibility that there could be one. You haven't proven that you dislike all of the apples.
Yeah.
It's like,
the funny thing about that claim, because I like this example a lot, is that this can also be used for a particular apple lover.
yeah.
Because let's say I love Fuji apples, and I know that and I think they're the best apple.
This is the apple.
Right? Then you just have to say, have you tried all the apples? How do you know that this is the best? It's the exact same problem. So in other words, yeah it's silly.
Well, yeah, and the point is that, like, both theism and atheism are referencing this category of God as an idea, and there's a lot of different ways to interpret it, but to say that you believe in it and not believe in it makes just as much sense. They're on the same footing again when it comes to making claims about the world. Just because there's maybe some defeater that hasn't been considered does not change this discussion at all. It applies to both of them equally.
Okay. Now, the other hot thing I have to say is in regard to the popular thought of a certain Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
I know. It's not just him, but he's the popular guy. So there is an idea that it is impossible to live atheistically. Remember, we've defined theism and atheism more technically as, there are orientations towards the world. You take there to be a God for whatever reason, or you take there to not be a God. And basically, the argument from these sorts of people, and more specifically from Jordan Peterson, is that God is the ultimate thing in your life. God is that kind of transcendental idea that informs everything that you do at the most fundamental level. And so it's basically the argument that you can't take that away, because you always live in reference to some transcendent ideal, right? And even if you don't call that thing God, that is what a God is, right? So two things. One, it's a clear redefinition of terms, which fine. That's fine. If we really want to say that a better definition of God is in fact a transcendental ideal instead of what is normally posited and rejected by people who are atheists.
Your superlative motivator.
yeah. That's okay. But there's a second thing, and this is very important, which is kind of a logical, funny thing, which is that if you can't if it's true that it's impossible to not orient yourself towards God, then you haven't gotten us anywhere.
Yeah.
All you've proven is that everybody lives in accord with the transcendental ideal. Cool. Well, then the atheist just is basically someone who wants to separate themselves from these more specific and higher level things that are, more traditional theism, and that's what they're comparing themselves against.
Yes. Well, no, literally, you just have to ask yourself the Wittgensteinian question of like, okay, wait, but when they say that, does it make sense?
Yeah.
Because it does. Like, there's no one that's like, I'm just really confused. Like, I have no idea what you're saying here because you actually believe in a God. No. Yeah. They're still doing work as words. They still have meaning, even if you take everyone to be, believing in some ultimate in their life.
Just fine.
Yeah.
And this leads into the other half of it, which is that I do think, and I don't know of anybody, popular thinkers who are putting forth this idea, but I do think it's impossible to live agnostically.
Yeah.
So, and what I mean by that is taking agnosticism as an orientation. I don't think agnosticism can function like that. Yeah. You have to have a kind of orientation in your life. And maybe this is really what people like Jordan Peterson are getting at, is that there is always a more fundamental orientation that's going on. You can't just live skeptically. To live skeptically would be to do, like in a really literal sense, would be to just do nothing, right? So I do think that there's something to say there, but it doesn't have to even be atheism and theism. I'm not trying to draw a hard bifurcation there either. There can be other things that you are explicitly oriented towards, but you are definitely oriented towards something.
And I think one way of talking about orientation is that even if you don't know something is the case, you act as though you know this is the case, and then you let that fail if it fails type of thing. Yeah. And that's part of the reason why it runs up against agnosticism, because agnosticism is explicitly saying, I won't say that I know, and I won't say that I don't know either. I won't answer that question. And I think that you can't orient yourself towards that because that like orientation requires you to be treating something as if you know it is the case. A really great way of talking about this is like, you can't be agnostic about medicine, about the field of medicine, and then still participate in the field of medicine, because you going to your doctor when you're sick is a way of saying, I'm treating this as if I know that it works. And that's
or at least that you're orienting yourself towards it working.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the conflict there. You could definitely say that, and you could definitely sit down and be like, this is my ultimate thoughts on the medical field are skeptical. You could say that and think that. But when you're actually engaging with the world, you treat the world as if it makes sense to you to some extent.
Yeah.
And so you can't be ultimately agnostic about that while you're doing things.
Or maybe I think a better way to put it is you can't be only agnostic.
Yes.
Right.
That's probably
because I'm not trying to say that you can't be agnostic at all. Mm-hmm. Like, take this as a great example. You go to the doctor. That is an orientation towards medicine, but you can do that and be agnostic about the process, or not be agnostic about the process. And I think skeptical thinkers, what they're trying to advocate for is the fact that, well, of course you have to have an orientation, but it matters whether you take the metaphysics seriously or to what degree you take them seriously. That you only let yourself extend your theory so far, right? Yeah. And it would be a good thing to have a certain level of agnosticism about going to the doctor, right?
It's a good little seasoning for everything.
Yeah. So I guess I'm partly trying to say that I think a lot of people are all right in their own way, right? We've got the idea that as kind of a base metaphysical approach, agnosticism is a great idea. I gotta advocate for that one. There are a lot of problems with idealists and rationalists and so on, but that doesn't mean that you can't or don't live with orientation.
Yep. Yeah.
taken up enough of your time, probably. Pleasure as always. We will see you, well, possibly next week.